I'm Heather, 29, and last month my own mother threw me out of Sunday dinner because I bought an $800 abandoned house instead of funding my sister's yoga retreat to Bali. I still remember her face twisting with disgust as she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Then live like junk. You've shamed this family." My crime? Choosing my dream over my sister Madison's. Before I tell you how I turned this disaster into the greatest decision of my life, let me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe if you've ever had to choose yourself first. Growing up in Westfield Heights, our family always appeared perfect from the outside. My parents, Diana and Richard Thompson, built their entire lives around what others thought. Our colonial-style house wasn't the biggest on the block, but Mom made sure it was the most pristine. Dad worked 60-hour weeks at his financial consulting firm while Mom maintained her position as chairwoman of 3 different community committees. Image was everything. From childhood, the roles were clear. Madison, my younger sister by 4 years, was the gifted one, the artist, the special one with extraordinary potential. I was the responsible one, the practical one, the one who would always land on her feet. This really meant I was expected to be the support system while Madison shined. "Heather, be reasonable," became my mother's catchphrase whenever I expressed a desire for something impractical or expensive. Yet when Madison wanted oil painting lessons from a renowned artist at 15, the checkbook appeared instantly. When she needed a semester in Paris to find her artistic voice during college, they remortgaged the house. Meanwhile, I worked part-time through high school and college, graduating with a practical degree in paralegal studies that allowed me to find stable employment immediately. My parents nodded with approval but not excitement. "That's our Heather," Dad would say, always making the sensible choice. Our family's financial situation wasn't actually as robust as my parents pretended. Dad's business had several down years during the recession, and their spending on Madison's various pursuits had depleted much of their savings. Not that they'd ever admit this to anyone outside the family. They still hosted elaborate dinner parties and took annual vacations to destinations that would photograph well for Mom's social media. The greatest irony was that despite my practical nature, I was developing a deep frustration with the superficiality of it all. In quiet moments, I found myself drawn to authenticity, old things with character, neighborhoods with history, people who spoke their minds. These attractions were barely conscious until they suddenly crystallized around an abandoned house. 3 years ago, when Madison decided she needed to attend a prestigious art school in New York, my parents approached me about helping out the family. Despite my modest paralegal salary, I had managed to save nearly $30,000 through careful budgeting. That money was supposed to be my future house down payment. "It's just until we get back on our feet," Dad explained. "Madison's education is an investment in her future." I transferred $25,000 to them the next day. Madison never thanked me directly. Instead, she sent a group text with a photo of her new studio apartment in Manhattan with the caption "Dreams becoming reality." #blessed, #grateful. The money was never mentioned again, except when I brought it up once at a family dinner about a year later. "Still counting pennies, Heather?" my mother responded with an uncomfortable laugh. "You know, family doesn't keep score." Our Sunday family dinners had become increasingly tense as I entered my late 20s. Each gathering featured my mother's passive-aggressive comments about my apartment, so cozy, my wardrobe, so practical, and my dating life. "There's someone for everyone, dear." Madison, now 25, remained the sun around which our family orbited. Her latest passion was wellness and spirituality, having abandoned painting after deciding it was too confining for her spirit. She'd been taking yoga teacher training and speaking incessantly about chakras, energy fields, and manifesting abundance. The irony that her abundance came directly from our parents' bank account seemed lost on everyone but me. My father had grown increasingly quiet over the years, retreating into work and whiskey. The financial pressure of maintaining appearances while funding Madison's meandering journey through self-discovery had carved deep lines around his eyes. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with something like apology, but these moments passed quickly. The Robertsons' daughter just bought a condo in that new development downtown, my mother announced at dinner one Sunday, her eyes sliding meaningfully toward me. Such a beautiful view. Her parents are so proud. That's nice, I replied, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate. Housing prices are crazy these days. Well, when you prioritize, my mother began her familiar refrain. I simply nodded, having learned long ago that disagreeing just prolonged these conversations. Besides, something was shifting in me. At 29, I was tired of nodding and accommodating. I was tired of being the responsible one who never got to dream. I was tired of living in my cramped apartment with rent that increased yearly while my savings remained stagnant. Something had to change, but I had no idea that change was just a late-night real estate search away. My apartment situation had gone from frustrating to desperate. The 800-square-foot one-bedroom I'd rented for 6 years was in a building that had just been sold to developers. All tenants received notices that our leases wouldn't be renewed after the current term. With just 2 months to find a new place and rents in the area skyrocketing, panic set in. On a Tuesday night after working late, I found myself scrolling through real estate listings, feeling a growing knot in my stomach as each property appeared more expensive than the last. I'd set my filters to show the lowest-priced properties first, but even those were well beyond what I could afford without depleting my rebuilt savings. Then it appeared, a property so outlandishly underpriced that I assumed it was a typo. $800, the listing read, accompanied by a single, blurry exterior photo of what appeared to be a small house nearly swallowed by overgrown vegetation. The description was sparse. Property sold as is. Tax foreclosure auction. Serious inquiries only. Cash sale. I clicked on it, expecting to find it was actually $800,000 or perhaps just a vacant lot. But no, additional details confirmed it was indeed an actual house being sold for $800 through a county tax auction. The catch was obvious from the interior photos. The place was a disaster. Water damage had buckled the floors, parts of the ceiling had collapsed, and what appeared to be decades of neglect had left every surface in a state of decay. Yet something about it captivated me. Behind the ruin, I could see the bones of a 1930s craftsman bungalow, architectural details that modern builders would never include. Bay windows with diamond-patterned panes. Built-in bookshelves flanking a brick fireplace. Arched doorways between rooms. I stayed up until 3 a.m. researching tax foreclosure auctions, the neighborhood, and renovation costs. The property was in Oakwood, a historically working-class area that had seen better days but wasn't dangerous, just overlooked. The house had been abandoned for 8 years after the elderly owner died without heirs, and property taxes had gone unpaid until the county seized it. The next morning, running on 2 hours of sleep and a dangerous amount of coffee, I called the number on the listing. The county clerk seemed surprised anyone was interested and agreed to let me view the property that afternoon. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Driving into Oakwood felt like crossing an invisible boundary. Gone were the manicured lawns and luxury SUVs of my parents' neighborhood, replaced by chain-link fences and older model cars. The streets were narrower, the trees taller and less managed. It felt real in a way my parents' neighborhood never did. The house sat on a corner lot, a small bungalow with faded yellow paint peeling from its wooden siding. The yard was overgrown, but I could see hostas and daylilies struggling through the weeds. Someone had once lovingly gardened here. The front porch sagged dangerously on one side, and several windows were boarded up. "You sure you want to see inside?" asked the real estate agent who met me there, a middle-aged man named Frank who seemed eager to be done with this particular listing. "It's not safe, structurally speaking. County just wants it off their books." "I'm sure," I replied, surprised at my own conviction. The interior was worse than the photos suggested. The smell hit me first: mold, animal droppings, and the musty scent of long-abandoned spaces. Water stains mapped the ceiling like continents on a globe. The hardwood floors, once beautiful, were now warped and rotting in places. The kitchen contained appliances that belonged in a museum. Previous owner was living here until about age 95, Frank commented, carefully stepping over a collapsed section of ceiling. No family to help maintain it toward the end, then sat empty after she passed. Water damage is your biggest issue. Roof's been leaking for years. As Frank pointed out problem after problem, something strange was happening to me. Rather than being deterred, I felt increasingly drawn to the space. Behind the decay, I could see what this house had once been, and potentially could be again. The living room had a large picture window that would flood the space with morning light. The kitchen, though small, had a breakfast nook with windows on 3 sides. The 2 bedrooms were modestly sized but had high ceilings and original wood trim. Honestly, Frank said, you'd be better off bulldozing it and starting fresh. Even then, lots only worth maybe $20,000 in this neighborhood. But I wasn't seeing a teardown. I was seeing potential no one else could recognize. After the showing, I called Logan, a friend from college who worked as a contractor. I sent him the listing photos and asked for his honest assessment. "Are you insane?" was his first response. "That place is one strong wind away from collapsing. But structurally, if the foundation is solid, it could be saved, right?" I pressed. There was a long pause before he answered. "Theoretically, yes. The foundation looks like it might be okay from these photos. But Heather, you're talking a minimum of $60,000 in essential repairs just to make it habitable. New roof, electrical, plumbing, flooring. Probably more like $100,000 to make it nice. What if I did some of the work myself?" I asked. Logan laughed. "Do you know how to replace knob and tube wiring or install a bathroom vanity?" "I could learn," I said, surprising myself with my determination. "Look, I'm not saying it's impossible," Logan conceded. "These old houses were built solid. But it would be a massive undertaking, especially for someone with no experience. And you'd still need professional help for the specialized work." I thanked him and spent the rest of the day researching renovation costs, DIY home repair, and the housing market in Oakwood. The more I learned, the more the idea crystallized. This was my opportunity. Even with renovation costs, I'd be spending far less than a down payment on a conventional home. And in the end, I'd have something that was truly mine, shaped by my own hands. The auction was scheduled for the following week. I spent every night researching, planning, making budgets, and watching renovation videos. I visited the house twice more, each time seeing beyond the current state to what could be. I spoke with a structural engineer who, after a thorough inspection, confirmed that while the house needed extensive work, the foundation was indeed solid and the major support beams were intact. On auction day, I arrived with a cashier's check and a pounding heart. To my surprise, there were only 2 other bidders, a house flipper looking for quick investments and an elderly man representing a church that wanted to expand its parking lot. When the opening bid of $800 was announced, I immediately raised my hand. The house flipper countered with $1,200. I went to $1,500. He hesitated, walked around me to get a better look, then shook his head and walked away. The church representative never bid. Just like that, for $1,500. Less than 2 months' rent for my apartment. I owned a house. A disaster of a house, but mine nonetheless. As I signed the paperwork, Frank shook his head. "I hope you know what you're getting into, young lady." I wasn't sure I did. But for the first time in my life, I was making a decision that wasn't the sensible choice others expected of me. It was a choice for myself, based on a vision only I could see. I felt terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. What I didn't know then was that my impulsive purchase would become not just a test of my determination and abilities, but of my relationship with my family as well. The battle lines were about to be drawn at Sunday dinner. The following Sunday, I drove to my parents' house with a mixture of excitement and dread churning in my stomach. I'd spent the week meeting with the city building department, getting utility information, and starting to clear some of the yard so I could access the house more easily. My hands were scratched from pulling brambles, and I had a small blister forming on my palm, badges of honor from my first efforts at homeownership. I debated whether to share my news at all, knowing it would likely be met with criticism. But a larger part of me wanted my family to see this different side of me, the risk-taker, the visionary. Perhaps naively, I hoped they might even be proud of my independence. As usual, I arrived exactly at 5 o'clock. Madison's car was already in the driveway. Her punctuality had never been a family requirement the way it was for me. When I entered, I found them already gathered in the living room, Madison animated at the center of attention. "It's truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," she was saying, her hands moving expressively as my parents nodded with rapt attention. This retreat center in Bali is where all the top influencers go for teacher training. 2 full weeks of immersion with Master Sanjeev himself. "It sounds transformative, sweetie," my mother responded, handing Madison a glass of wine. "Oh, Heather, you're here. Perfect timing. Madison was just telling us about this amazing yoga opportunity she's discovered." "I heard," I said, accepting the significantly less full wine glass my mother offered me. "Sounds interesting." "It's not just interesting. It's essential for my development as a teacher," Madison continued. "The connections alone are worth the investment. There's a chance to get certified in aqua yoga, which is huge right now." My father nodded thoughtfully. "And you said the total cost is how much again?" "Just under $15,000, Madison replied casually. "That includes the training, accommodations, special excursions, and airfare. It's actually incredibly reasonable considering what you get." I nearly choked on my wine. $15,000 was almost half my annual take-home pay. "Of course, I'll need to leave my apartment since I can't pay rent while I'm away not working," Madison added. "But I was thinking I could store my things and stay here for a few months when I get back. Just until I build my client base." "You know you always have a place here," my mother assured her, patting her hand. My father cleared his throat. "We can manage some of this, princess, but not the full amount right now. Business has been a bit tight lately." Madison's face fell dramatically. "But Dad, this starts in 6 weeks. If I miss this chance with Master Sanjeev, who knows when he'll be offering it again?" My mother shot my father a warning look before turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Heather, sweetie, we were thinking, you're always so good with money. Perhaps you could help sponsor part of Madison's training? $5,000 would make all the difference. Think of it as an investment in her future. You know she'll pay it forward when she's running her own yoga empire." The room went silent as they all turned to look at me expectantly. This was the moment I'd been dreading, yet it also crystallized something important. They saw me as nothing more than a support system for the family, particularly for Madison. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I've made an investment of my own recently. I bought a house." There was a moment of stunned silence before my mother broke into a delighted smile. "Heather, why didn't you tell us you were house hunting? That's wonderful news." "Yes, congratulations," my father added, looking genuinely pleased. "Where is it?" "One of those new townhomes near your office." "No, it's in Oakwood," I replied. "It's actually an older home that needs some renovation." My mother's smile faltered. "Oakwood? Isn't that rather transitional?" "It's an established neighborhood with history," I said. "The house is a 1930s craftsman bungalow with a lot of original features." "Well, that sounds nice," my father said cautiously. "Older homes can be charming." "What did you pay, if you don't mind my asking?" "Those types of homes can be surprising bargains." Here it was, the moment of truth. I took a deep breath. $800 initially, though the final price at auction was $1,500. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth. My father blinked rapidly as if trying to process a complex equation. Madison was the first to respond. "That's not possible," she said flatly. "Houses don't cost $1,500. "This one did," I replied. "It was a tax foreclosure auction. The house has been abandoned for years and needs significant work, but the structure is sound, and—" "You bought a crack house?" my mother interrupted, her voice rising in horror. "No, Mom, I bought a neglected house that needs renovation. It's not a crack house. It's a solid craftsman with good bones that—" "I cannot believe you would do something so irresponsible," my mother continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Have you even had it inspected? What about asbestos? Lead paint? Mold? I've had a structural engineer look at it, and yes, there are issues to address, but—" "So you bought a condemned property without consulting anyone?" My father joined in, his earlier pleasure completely evaporated. "Heather, this isn't like you to be so reckless." "It's not condemned, and it's not reckless," I insisted, feeling my face growing hot. "I've done my research. I have a budget and a plan. This is an opportunity to own a home outright, to create something beautiful with my own hands." Madison let out a dramatic sob. "So you're throwing away your money on a junk house instead of helping me with something important to my career? That's so selfish, Heather." "Selfish?" I repeated, incredulous. "I gave you $25,000 for art school 3 years ago, money I'd saved for a down payment. Money you never thanked me for or offered to repay. How is it selfish to finally do something for myself?" "That was different," my mother snapped. "Your sister's education was an investment in her future. This sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. What will people think?" "I don't care what people think," I said, surprised at my own boldness. "For once, I'm doing something because it matters to me, not because of how it looks to others." My father stood up, pacing with agitation. "Heather, be reasonable. You know nothing about renovation. You'll sink money into this project, and end up with a worthless property in a declining neighborhood. If you wanted a house, we could have helped you find something appropriate." "Appropriate according to whom?" I challenged. "This is my decision. My investment. My vision." "So that's a no on helping your sister?" my mother asked coldly. I looked at Madison, who was now crying silently, her shoulders shaking in a way that seemed rehearsed for maximum effect. "Yes, that's a no," I said firmly. "I need my savings for my own home." My mother's face hardened into a mask of disapproval I'd seen many times, but never directed so intensely at me. "Then I think you should leave." "Diana," my father began, but she silenced him with a look. "If Heather wants to throw away her future on a junk house instead of supporting her family, then she can go live in it right now," my mother declared. "I won't have this selfishness at my dinner table." I stood, oddly calm despite the storm raging around me. "Mom, this isn't fair." "No, what's not fair is raising a daughter who turns her back on her family the moment something shiny catches her eye," she snapped. "You've always been practical, dependable. Now suddenly you're buying derelict properties in questionable neighborhoods? What's next, Heather? Face tattoos? A motorcycle gang?" The absurdity of her statement might have made me laugh in another context. Instead, I gathered my purse and jacket. "I'm still practical and dependable," I said quietly. "I'm just finally applying those qualities to my own dreams instead of everyone else's." As I walked toward the door, my mother called after me. "When this falls apart, and it will, don't come crying to us. You've made your choice." I paused at the door, turning to face my family one last time. My father looked torn, my sister smugly victorious through her tears, and my mother coldly furious. "Yes," I said. "I have made my choice." "Then live like junk," my mother said dismissively. "You've shamed this family." The drive home was a blur of tears and doubt. Had I made a terrible mistake? Was I throwing away my security for a fantasy that would collapse around me? For the first time in my life, I'd stood up for my own desires against my family's expectations, and the ground beneath me felt terrifyingly unsteady. When I pulled up to my apartment building, I sat in the car for a long time. Then, making a sudden decision, I put the car in drive and headed toward Oakwood. Toward my house. It might be a disaster, but it was my disaster. And somehow, that made all the difference. The week after the family dinner disaster, my apartment lease ended, creating an immediate housing crisis. With most of my savings tied up in renovation plans, I couldn't afford first and last month's rent plus security deposit on a new apartment. The cheapest extended stay motel I could find was still eating through my budget at an alarming rate. Something had to change quickly. 2 weeks after purchasing the house, I made the drastic decision to make it minimally habitable and move in. The city inspector had verified that the structure wasn't in danger of imminent collapse, though he looked at me like I was insane when I mentioned my plans to live there during renovation. At minimum, young lady, you need a functioning bathroom, safe electrical, and a secure exterior before occupancy, he said, shaking his head as he wrote up the inspection report. I focused on those 3 essentials, hiring professionals for the critical electrical work and plumbing connections while learning to do what I could myself. YouTube became my constant companion as I figured out how to replace a toilet, patch drywall, and remove layers of ancient wallpaper. The first night I slept in the house was both terrifying and strangely peaceful. I'd set up a camping cot in what would eventually be the living room, with my sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, and a baseball bat beside me. The house creaked and settled around me in the darkness. Distant sirens and occasional traffic provided the soundtrack to my new beginning. I lay awake for hours, alternating between panic at what I'd done and fierce determination to prove my family wrong. Around 3 a.m., tears came, not just for the magnitude of the task ahead, but for the family support I'd always counted on that was now gone. I'd never felt so alone. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the plastic sheeting I'd taped over a missing window pane. In the daylight, the house looked even worse than I remembered, but also somehow more full of possibility. This was day 1 of my new life. As I sat on my front steps drinking coffee from a thermos, an elderly woman approached from the house next door. I tensed, expecting complaints about my dilapidated property bringing down neighborhood values. "So you're the one who bought Esther's place," she said, studying me carefully. She introduced herself as Grace Washington, 82 years old and resident of Oakwood for over 50 years. "I'm Heather," I replied, standing to shake her hand. "And yes, I'm trying to restore it." "Restore," she repeated, nodding approvingly. "Not tear down." "That's good. This neighborhood's seen enough tearing down." Over the next hour, Grace shared the history of my house and the surrounding area. Esther Jenkins, the previous owner, had been her best friend for decades. The house had once been the pride of the block, with Esther's garden winning neighborhood awards. Esther's children had moved away years ago and rarely visited, even when she became too frail to maintain the property. She would be glad someone's bringing it back to life, Grace said finally. Instead of those developers who just want to bulldoze everything with history, Grace's stories gave my project new meaning. This wasn't just about proving my independence or saving money. It was about honoring the history of this house and the woman who had loved it. The next few weeks fell into an exhausting rhythm. I'd wake before dawn, work on the house until I had to leave for my paralegal job, then return and work until I couldn't keep my eyes open. Weekends were fully dedicated to renovation. I created a detailed renovation plan, prioritizing essentials. Roof repairs to stop ongoing water damage, basic bathroom functionality, kitchen sink and minimal countertop, secure doors and windows. Cosmetic improvements would have to wait. Budget constraints forced me to learn skills I never imagined I'd need. I taught myself to replace rotted floorboards by watching online tutorials. I learned the difference between load-bearing and non-load-bearing walls through library books. I figured out how to identify knob and tube wiring that needed professional replacement versus simple fixes I could handle myself. A few friends helped when they could. Logan, true to his word, came by on occasional weekends to tackle projects that required his expertise, refusing payment but accepting homemade sandwiches and beer. My coworker Zoe, who had renovated her own bathroom the previous year, spent a Saturday helping me install a salvaged clawfoot tub I'd found on an online marketplace for $75. But most of the time, I worked alone, learning through trial and error. There were countless mistakes. The bathroom tile I had to rip out and restart 3 times before getting it right. The cabinet I assembled backward. The paint color that looked completely different on the wall than on the sample card. The physical toll was significant. My hands developed calluses I'd never had before. My back ached constantly. I suffered minor injuries, cuts, bruises, a sprained wrist from falling through a rotted section of subflooring I hadn't noticed was compromised. The emotional challenges were just as difficult. Isolation from my family left a void I hadn't anticipated. When I hit obstacles, there was no safety net of parental advice or assistance. Each setback required me to dig deeper into my own reserves of determination. There were days when the magnitude of what I'd undertaken overwhelmed me completely. One particularly low moment came when I discovered extensive termite damage in one corner of the house, requiring immediate professional intervention I couldn't afford. I sat on the front steps that evening, covered in dust and defeat, wondering if my mother had been right all along. But there were victories too. The first time I successfully installed a light fixture and flipped the switch to see it work. The bathroom shower that finally ran without leaking. The front door I stripped of 7 layers of paint to reveal beautiful oak grain beneath. Each small accomplishment fueled my determination for the next challenge. Neighbors gradually took notice of my efforts. At first, most were skeptical, watching from a distance as the young woman in work clothes hauled debris to the rented dumpster day after day. But as visible improvements emerged, attitudes shifted. Mr. Patterson from across the street brought over his power washer one Saturday to help clean the brick pathway. A family down the block with teenage sons offered their help clearing the overgrown backyard in exchange for some salvaged bricks I wasn't using. Grace regularly appeared with sandwiches or homemade soup, sitting with me during lunch breaks to share more neighborhood stories. 6 weeks into the renovation, I posted before and after photos of the cleared front yard and newly repaired front porch on social media. The responses were mixed. Friends expressed amazement and support. Extended family members I rarely heard from suddenly had opinions about my impulsive decision. My post received an unexpected like from my father, though he didn't comment. Madison sent a private message. Looks exhausting. Hope you're not in over your head. Mom, still upset. Retreat postponed, by the way. I didn't respond. The growing distance from my immediate family created a strange combination of grief and liberation. For 29 years, their approval had been my North Star. Learning to navigate without it was disorienting but increasingly empowering. As summer progressed, the house slowly transformed from uninhabitable to basic functionality. I converted one bedroom into a livable space with proper insulation, drywall, and a lockable window. The bathroom, while far from beautiful, had a working toilet, sink, and shower. The kitchen contained a refurbished vintage stove I'd found at a salvage yard and enough counter space to prepare simple meals. It wasn't pretty yet, but it was becoming mine in a way nothing in my life ever had before. Each repair, each improvement bore the mark of my own hands and decisions. I was creating something authentic, not to impress others, but to fulfill my own vision. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the sensible, practical Heather fulfilling others' expectations. I was the visionary, the creator, the one who saw potential where others saw only ruin. What I didn't realize was that my personal renovation journey was about to face its greatest challenge yet, one that would test not just my renovation skills, but my newfound independence to its very core. 2 months into my renovation journey, the house had transformed from completely uninhabitable to merely uncomfortable. I'd established a functional bathroom, created one livable bedroom, and managed to get the kitchen sink and an ancient but operational refrigerator working. The roof no longer leaked in 3 places, just one stubborn spot over the hall that required a strategically placed bucket during rainstorms. My phone buzzed one Thursday evening as I was removing ancient linoleum to reveal the original hardwood floors beneath. I was shocked to see Madison's name on the screen, the first direct contact from my immediate family since the Sunday dinner blowout. "Hey, stranger," her voice came through, artificially bright. "Just checking in to see how you're surviving in your project house." The lack of genuine concern was evident, but I tried to be civil. "It's coming along. Lots of work still to do, but making progress." "That's great," Madison replied, her disinterest palpable. "So listen, Mom and Dad ended up helping me with the retreat, after all. I leave for Bali next week. But I wanted to swing by and see this place before I go. Maybe tomorrow afternoon?" Her sudden interest made me suspicious, but a small part of me hoped this might be an olive branch, a chance to repair the family rift. "Sure," I agreed cautiously. "But it's still pretty rough. Don't expect a showcase." Madison arrived the next day in her white Range Rover, a gift from our parents for her 25th birthday, looking comically out of place on my street of modest homes and older vehicles. She emerged wearing designer yoga pants and an expression of barely concealed horror. "Oh wow," she said, surveying the exterior. "It's really authentic." "It's a work in progress," I replied, leading her inside. I gave her the tour, pointing out the original features I was preserving and explaining my vision for each space. Madison nodded absently, occasionally taking her phone out to check the time, though I noticed the camera sound effect more than once. "So you're really living here?" she asked, poking at a partially demolished kitchen cabinet. "Like, sleeping here and everything?" "Yes, in the bedroom I showed you. It's actually quite comfortable now." Madison shook her head. "I just don't get it, Heather. You could have a normal apartment. Instead, you're camping in a construction zone in a sketchy neighborhood." "It's not sketchy," I said defensively. "It's a stable working-class area with history and character. The neighbors have been wonderful." "If you say so," she shrugged. "Well, I should get going. Good luck with all this." Her visit lasted less than 15 minutes. The next morning, I discovered why she'd really come when I checked my family's group chat, which had been silent since our falling out. Madison had posted several photos of the house, all carefully angled to capture the worst aspects while avoiding any of the improvements I'd made. Checking on my sister's investment property before leaving for Bali, she'd written, "Concerned about her living conditions. Maybe we should organize an intervention when I get back." My mother had replied, "I had no idea it was this bad. Richard, we need to talk about this. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown." My father, "Let's not jump to conclusions." Madison, "Did Heather seem okay otherwise?" Madison, "Define okay?" "She's living with exposed wiring and using a camping shower. Plus the neighborhood is super sketchy." I was afraid to leave my car unattended. My stomach churned as I read through the exchange. Not once had they reached out to me directly with their concerns. Instead, they were discussing me as if I were an unstable relative who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. Within days, extended family members began calling and texting. Aunts, uncles, cousins I rarely spoke with, all expressing concern about my living situation. It became clear that my mother had shared Madison's photos widely, accompanied by her own narrative about my apparent mental decline. "Honey, your mother tells me you're living in a condemned house without running water," my Aunt Patricia said when she called. "You know you can always come stay with us until you get back on your feet." "The house isn't condemned, and I have running water," I explained for what felt like the 100th time. "I'm renovating it. It's an investment and a project I'm passionate about." Few seemed to hear me. The family narrative had been established. Heather had lost her mind, bought a death trap, and needed intervention. The renovation was already pushing me to my physical and financial limits without this added emotional strain. My job performance was suffering from exhaustion and stress. My supervisor had called me in for a check-in about my declining attention to detail and occasional tardiness, previously unheard of in my work history. I was attempting to balance too many things at once, and the cracks were beginning to show. But I was too stubborn to admit it, especially now that my family's judgment loomed over everything. Then disaster struck. A severe summer thunderstorm hit one night while I was at work late trying to catch up on neglected tasks. I returned home to find water pouring through the ceiling in the living room. The tarp covering the section of roof I hadn't yet been able to repair had torn free in the high winds, allowing the torrential rain direct access to the house's interior. Water had soaked the newly installed drywall, damaged the electrical work I'd just paid a professional to complete, and pooled on the original hardwood floors I'd spent weeks carefully restoring. The damage was catastrophic. I worked through the night moving buckets, sopping up water, and trying to minimize the destruction. By morning, I was soaked, exhausted, and facing the reality that this setback would cost thousands I didn't have. My emergency fund was nearly depleted, and my credit cards were approaching their limits. Sitting in the middle of my flooded living room at dawn, surrounded by sodden drywall and warping floorboards, I finally broke. The tears came in heaving sobs that felt torn from somewhere deep inside me. I'd been so determined to prove everyone wrong, to show I could do this on my own. But maybe they were right. Maybe this had been a foolish, irresponsible dream. For a brief, dark moment, I considered calling my parents to admit defeat. The thought of my mother's satisfied "I told you so" stopped me. Even in my lowest moment, I couldn't bear to give her that victory. Instead, I called in sick to work for the second time in my employment history and spent the day assessing the damage and researching emergency home repair loans. The news was grim. Without better credit or more equity, my options were limited to high-interest loans that would put me even further behind. That evening, a knock at my door revealed Grace, my elderly neighbor, holding a covered dish. "Saw your lights on all night during the storm," she said simply. "Figured you could use some dinner." When she saw my red-rimmed eyes and the destruction behind me, she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. After surveying the damage, she sat me down at my makeshift kitchen table and made me eat some of her chicken casserole. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," she said, watching me pick at the food. Too stubborn to ask for help, too determined to give up. "The roof's going to cost at least $4,000 to fix properly," I confessed. "I don't have it." "I've been patching and hoping, but now." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Esther, the woman who owned this house before, she and I bought these homes the same year. 1969. We were both single women when that wasn't something people did. Everyone said we were making a mistake, that we needed a man to take care of home repairs, that these old houses would bankrupt us." I looked up, suddenly more interested in her story than my own problems. "We learned to help each other," Grace continued. "When her water heater burst, my brother-in-law helped install a new one. When my porch steps rotted through, Esther's cousin, who was a carpenter, rebuilt them. We created our own support system when the traditional one wasn't available to us." She reached across the table and patted my hand. "The mistake isn't buying this house, Heather. The mistake is thinking you have to do everything alone to prove your point." That night, after Grace left, I received a text from my mother. "Madison showed us the pictures. We're hearing concerning things about your living situation. Perhaps it's time to admit this experiment has failed. Your old room is still available." Attached was a listing for a condo in a new development near my parents' neighborhood. "Your father and I could help with the down payment if you end this house nonsense. Think about your future." In that moment, sitting amid the wreckage of my flooded living room, facing financial disaster and professional consequences, the easy path beckoned seductively. I could admit defeat, return to the safety of my parents' approval, and re-enter the role they had always defined for me. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Then I set the phone down without responding and picked up the hammer I'd left on the counter that morning. There was a damaged section of flooring that needed to be removed before it could mold. Grace was right. I didn't have to do everything alone, but I also didn't have to surrender my dream to secure help. There was a middle path forward, one that would require me to be vulnerable in new ways, to accept assistance without giving up agency. Tomorrow, I would begin reaching out to the network I'd been building, Logan with his construction contacts, the local historical society that had expressed interest in homes of this era, even the neighbors who had offered help I'd been too proud to accept. My family wanted me to believe I had only two choices: succeed entirely on my own or admit complete failure. But as I worked into the night, removing damaged materials and preparing for the rebuild, I was discovering a third option: interdependence without surrender. The road ahead would be challenging, and the outcome remained uncertain. But one thing had become crystal clear in the flood's aftermath: this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about defining myself on my own terms, about building not just walls and floors, but a life of authentic choice. As I finally fell into exhausted sleep on my camping cot that night, I realized something important. No matter what happened with the house, I would never again be the person who automatically said yes to others at the expense of my own dreams. That transformation, at least, was waterproof. 6 months into my renovation journey, the house was beginning to reveal its potential. The catastrophic roof leak had forced me to address structural issues I'd been postponing, and while it depleted my financial reserves, the results were transformative. With a properly repaired roof, the interior work could finally proceed without fear of weather damage. My approach to renovation had evolved dramatically. Through necessity and Grace's wisdom, I'd learned to accept help without surrendering control. Logan connected me with his construction industry network, introducing me to tradespeople willing to barter services or provide materials at cost. In exchange, I offered my paralegal skills, helping several contractors with legal documentation and permit applications. I discovered a talent for finding materials that others overlooked. The local salvage yard became my second home, where I uncovered period-appropriate fixtures, doors, and woodwork from demolished historic homes. What I lacked in funds, I made up for in research, patience, and willingness to repurpose what others discarded. My DIY skills improved with practice. Tasks that once took me an entire weekend now required only hours. I learned to replicate original woodwork details, repair plaster walls, and refinish hardwood floors. YouTube remained my instructor, but increasingly I found myself solving problems through my own creativity rather than external guidance. One Saturday morning in early fall, I was working on the front porch, carefully reconstructing a section of decorative railing when a truck pulled up. A man about my age stepped out, carrying a toolbox. "You must be Heather," he said. "I'm Ryan. Logan mentioned you were looking for someone to help with some built-in cabinetry." Ryan was a local woodworker who specialized in historic restoration. He'd grown up in Oakwood and returned after art school, converting an old warehouse space into a woodworking shop. Unlike the contractors who saw only problems in my century-old house, Ryan immediately recognized its craftsmanship. "These aren't just houses," he explained as he examined the original built-in bookshelves I hoped to restore. "They're functional art. The people who built them were craftsmen who took pride in their work. You don't see joinery like this anymore." Ryan became a regular presence as the renovation progressed, initially helping with specific woodworking projects, but increasingly offering assistance with other aspects of the restoration. His knowledge of historical techniques proved invaluable, and his passion for preservation matched my own growing commitment to honoring the house's origins. One evening, as we finished installing restored kitchen cabinets, Ryan pointed out a detail I hadn't noticed: a small symbol carved into the wood frame. "That's a craftsman's mark," he explained. "The carpenter who built these cabinets signed his work." People took pride in building things meant to last generations. Something about his observation resonated deeply with me. I'd begun this project focused primarily on economics, a cheap house I could afford on my own. But it had evolved into something more meaningful, a commitment to preservation, to craftsmanship, to creating something of lasting value. That night, I researched the history of craftsman bungalows in our region and discovered that my house, while modest, was part of a significant architectural movement. The following day, I contacted the local historical society to learn more about my specific property. To my surprise, they were already aware of my renovation efforts. Several members arranged to visit, excited that someone was restoring rather than demolishing one of the neighborhood's original homes. They brought historical photographs showing my house in its prime, including images of Esther's award-winning gardens from the 1970s. This area was originally built for skilled tradespeople working at the furniture factory downtown, explained Eleanor, the Historical Society president. These weren't mansions, but they were quality homes built with materials and craftsmanship you can't find today. The Historical Society offered guidance on historically accurate restoration techniques and connected me with resources for tax incentives available for historic preservation. They also suggested documenting my renovation process, which inspired me to create a dedicated social media account for the project. What began as casual before and after photos evolved into a detailed chronicle of the restoration process. To my surprise, the account gained a modest following of renovation enthusiasts, preservationists, and others undertaking similar projects. Comments and messages offered encouragement, suggestions, and validation when I doubted my decisions. 8 months into the renovation, a local newspaper reporter doing a story on neighborhood revitalization noticed my project. The resulting article, "Young Homeowner Breathes New Life into Historic Oakwood Bungalow," included photographs of the restoration progress and quotes from neighbors about the positive impact on the community. The day after the article appeared, I organized a small open house for neighbors who had expressed curiosity about the interior transformation. Grace helped me prepare simple refreshments, and Ryan assisted with last-minute touch-ups to the newly restored living room. Nearly 20 neighbors attended, wandering through the partially completed rooms with expressions of amazement. Many shared memories of Esther and the house in its prime. Several offered additional historical information about the neighborhood or technical advice based on their own home experiences. Mr. Patterson, who had loaned me his power washer months earlier, brought his brother who worked in landscaping. Together they offered to help restore the backyard to something reminiscent of Esther's famous gardens. Another neighbor, a retired electrician, volunteered to check my electrical work and make recommendations for historically appropriate lighting fixtures. What had begun as my solitary project was evolving into a community effort, not because I couldn't manage alone, but because the house itself had become a focal point for neighborhood pride and connection. The most unexpected development came through the Historical Society. Eleanor contacted me about a preservation grant program I might qualify for, given my commitment to authentic restoration. The application process was complex, requiring detailed documentation of the historical features I was preserving and plans for completing the restoration. Working on the application during evenings and weekends, I created a comprehensive portfolio of the house's architectural elements, restoration techniques, and historical significance. Ryan contributed beautifully rendered sketches of the completed restoration vision, while Grace provided oral history about the neighborhood's development. 3 weeks after submission, I received the call I'd scarcely allowed myself to hope for. My project had been awarded a $15,000 preservation grant. The funds would allow me to complete the exterior restoration properly, including rebuilding the distinctive front porch that had been the house's defining feature in historical photographs. The grant validation transformed how I viewed the project and myself. What had begun as an impulsive, potentially foolish decision was now recognized as valuable preservation work. My vision, which my family had dismissed as delusion, was being affirmed by experts in architecture and history. An independent appraiser required as part of the grant process valued the property at $82,000 in its current partially restored state, already a substantial increase from my $1,500 purchase price. With completed renovations, he estimated the value would exceed $175,000, though he noted that the true value of historically preserved homes often transcended simple market appraisals. As news of the grant and the newspaper article circulated, I began receiving messages from my extended family, subtle shifts in tone from concern to curiosity. A cousin who had previously expressed worry about my unsafe living conditions now asked for advice about restoring her own older home's features. An uncle who had sided with my mother now requested a tour when he was next in town. Then came the message I hadn't expected, from Madison, newly returned from Bali. Her retreat had apparently been transformative, though not in the way she'd anticipated. Her initial yoga certification complete, she had discovered the spiritual experience wasn't translating into the lucrative teaching career she'd expected. Now unemployed, she had moved back into our parents' home, temporarily. Saw the article about your house, her text read. Looks like it's coming along. Didn't realize it was considered historic or whatever. Anyway, things are intense here with Mom. Mind if I come by sometime? Maybe stay for a few days in your guest room. The irony wasn't lost on me. The sister who had mocked my junk house was now seeking refuge in it. The guest room she referenced was months from completion, still serving as storage for materials and tools. Before I could formulate a response, another notification appeared. My mother had finally broken her silence with a brief message. Your father and I noticed your house in the paper. The porch looks nice. The Hendersons asked about you at church. No acknowledgement of her previous condemnation. No apology for months of silence. Just an observation about appearances and what others thought, her perennial concerns. I set my phone aside without responding to either message, needing time to process this sudden shift in family dynamics. Outside my window, Ryan was unloading lumber for the front porch restoration, laughing with Grace, who had brought him a glass of lemonade. Down the street, Mr. Patterson and his brother were discussing plans for the garden restoration with another neighbor who had joined the effort. In their absence, my family had declared me a failure for pursuing this dream. Now that external validation was making it acceptable, they wanted to reconnect, on their terms, without acknowledging the hurt they'd caused or the growth I'd experienced. As I watched the community that had formed around my renovation project, people who had supported me when I needed it most, who saw value in preservation and authenticity rather than status and appearance, I realized I had gained something far more precious than property value or family approval. I had found my own definition of home. 1 year after purchasing my $800 junk house, I stood in the center of my fully restored living room, barely recognizing it as the same space I'd first encountered. The water-damaged ceilings had been repaired with period-appropriate techniques. The hardwood floors gleamed with a warm patina that only century-old oak can develop. The brick fireplace, once covered in layers of paint, now showcased its original craftsmanship, complemented by the restored built-in bookshelves flanking it. Morning light streamed through diamond-patterned leaded glass windows that Ryan and I had painstakingly rebuilt pane by pane. The walls, painted in a historically accurate warm cream, provided the perfect backdrop for the black and white photographs of the house through various decades that the Historical Society had helped me collect and frame. The transformation extended throughout the house. The kitchen, while maintaining its original footprint, now featured restored cabinetry and soapstone countertops salvaged from a demolished 1920s pharmacy. The bathroom blended period authenticity with modern function. The clawfoot tub I'd rescued early in the renovation now gleamed next to hexagonal floor tiles that perfectly matched fragments we'd discovered during demolition. The 2 bedrooms had been restored to their original dimensions after I removed a poorly conceived 1970s modification. The front bedroom served as my personal space, while the second had indeed become a proper guest room, though not one I was eager to offer to Madison. Outside, the house was almost unrecognizable from the overgrown, dilapidated structure I'd purchased. The rebuilt front porch, with its distinctive craftsman columns, had become the centerpiece of the exterior restoration. Fresh yellow paint with white trim and forest green accents highlighted the architectural details. Mr. Patterson and his landscaper brother had indeed transformed the yard, incorporating elements inspired by historical photos of Esther's gardens while adapting plant selections for lower maintenance. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. A recent appraisal had valued the property at $178,000, an astonishing return on my initial $1,500 purchase price, even accounting for approximately $65,000 in renovation costs. More importantly, I own the house outright, with no mortgage debt, a financial freedom almost unheard of among my peers. Beyond the physical and financial aspects, the most profound transformation had been personal. The paralegal who had always followed the sensible path had discovered capabilities she never suspected, from sophisticated carpentry skills to grant writing, from historical research to community organizing. My renovation documentation on social media had grown to over 20,000 followers, and I'd begun receiving requests to consult on other historic restoration projects. The media attention had expanded beyond that initial newspaper article. A popular home renovation blog had featured my project in a detailed spread, and the local PBS station had included my house in a segment about neighborhood revitalization through historic preservation. Most recently, I'd been asked to participate in the annual Historic Homes Tour, an honor typically reserved for much grander properties. These public validations had predictably altered my family's perspective. Madison's request to stay a few days had been firmly but kindly declined, though I had met her for coffee several times. Her Bali retreat certification had indeed failed to translate into the lucrative career she'd envisioned, and she was now working part-time at a yoga studio while living with our parents and discovering her next passion. "I can't believe you did all this yourself," she'd said during her first visit to the completed house, her tone mixing admiration with something else, perhaps regret or envy. "Mom said it was a mistake, but this is actually really nice. Probably worth a lot now, right?" My relationship with my parents had entered an awkward reconciliation phase. After months of silence, my mother had begun reaching out with increasing frequency as news of my success spread through her social circles. Her texts evolved from brief acknowledgments to increasingly direct attempts to reinsert herself into my life. "The garden club is doing a spring tour," she wrote recently. "I mentioned your restoration project, and they're very interested in including your house. It would be a wonderful opportunity for networking." Translation: Now that your choices have proven socially acceptable, I'm willing to associate with them, and you, again. My father had made a more genuine effort, visiting alone one weekend to see the completed restoration. As he walked through the rooms, touching the original woodwork and examining the craftsmanship, I glimpsed a different man than the one who had always deferred to my mother's social concerns. "I worked construction during college summers," he confessed, surprising me with this never-shared detail. "Always enjoyed working with my hands, creating something tangible. The corporate path just seemed expected." That moment of authenticity had opened a door to a different kind of relationship, one based on genuine connection rather than expectations and appearances. We were still navigating this new territory carefully, but for the first time, I felt I was getting to know my father as a person rather than just a parent. The most unexpected family development came 3 weeks ago. My mother called, her voice carrying that familiar tone of practiced casualness that always masked an agenda. "Your father and I are considering some investment opportunities," she began. "Property values in certain areas are showing impressive growth potential. We wondered if you might have insights about Oakwood and similar neighborhoods. Perhaps we could discuss over dinner this Sunday." The irony was almost too perfect. The neighborhood they had considered dangerous and declining, the investment they had declared foolish, was now an opportunity they wished to exploit. The daughter they had dismissed as irresponsible was now a resource they hoped to tap. I agreed to dinner, not from eagerness to resume our former Sunday tradition, but from curiosity about how this new dynamic would unfold. The evening proved revealing. My mother alternated between compliments about my surprisingly charming house and not-so-subtle inquiries about which properties in the neighborhood might be available for investment opportunities. "Mrs. Hendricks mentioned your house will be on the Historical Society tour," she said while serving dessert. I told her I'd be happy to help host. After all, presentation is so important for these events. "That's a generous offer, Mom," I replied carefully, but the neighbors have already organized the hosting schedule. "Grace will be helping me." "Grace?" My mother's forehead creased. "The elderly woman next door? Well, I suppose that's nice. But surely you could use someone with more experience in these matters. My social club has organized several successful charity events." "Grace has lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years, I said. "She knew the original owner of my house and has been an invaluable resource throughout the restoration. There's no one better qualified to share the history with visitors." My mother's expression tightened momentarily before she recovered her social smile. "Of course, dear. I just thought you might want to make the best impression possible." I replied simply, by honoring the authentic history and community of this house, not by putting on a show. The conversation shifted, but the underlying dynamic had been established. My mother still viewed my choices through the lens of appearance and status. The difference now was that I no longer needed her approval to validate my decisions. After dinner, as I prepared to leave, my mother followed me to the door. "Heather," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "your home really is lovely. Different from what I would have chosen, but lovely. My social club is meeting next month. Perhaps I could bring them by for a tour afterward? They'd be very impressed." And there it was, the request I'd been anticipating. After dismissing my choice, after months of silence, after declaring I'd shamed the family, my mother now wanted to use my home, my work, my vision to enhance her social standing. A year ago, I would have eagerly accepted this olive branch, grateful for any approval. Now, I recognized it for what it was, not reconciliation but appropriation. "I'll think about it, Mom," I said gently. "Right now, my priority is preparing for the Historical Society tour. Why don't we talk about this after that's complete?" My mother's smile tightened again, but she nodded. "Of course. We'll discuss it later." As I drove back to my house, my home, I reflected on the journey of the past year. What had begun as a desperate financial decision had transformed not just a neglected house, but my understanding of worth, value, and authenticity. I pulled into my driveway, where solar-powered landscape lights illuminated the garden path. Through the front window, I could see the warm glow of the vintage light fixtures Ryan and I had rewired. On the porch, 2 Adirondack chairs waited for tomorrow morning's coffee with Grace. Inside, every square foot contained evidence of my labor, my choices, my vision brought to life. This house had taught me that true value isn't found in appearances or others' approval. It's created through commitment, authenticity, and the courage to see potential where others see only problems. My family had kicked me out for choosing an $800 junk house over funding my sister's retreat. They'd told me to live like junk and claimed I'd shamed them. Now they wanted in, not just to the house itself, but to the success and recognition it had garnered. But what they didn't understand was that the most valuable transformation wasn't in the property value or the social validation. It was in discovering that the strongest foundations aren't built with concrete and wood, but with authenticity, community, and the courage to define home on your own terms. Have you ever had to choose between family expectations and your own dreams? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey of transformation resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to join me for more stories of finding authenticity in unexpected places. Share with someone who might need encouragement to follow their own path, even when others don't understand it. Thank you for being part of this journey, and remember, sometimes the most beautiful renovations aren't about places, but people.